Well, hello to all. Welcome to another of our nature talks. And here we have got Ellie, very passionate, of course. I know, of course, about her passion and, of course, the burying beetles, which, of course, I'm a great fan of beetles. So, Ellie, before we begin, can you just introduce yourself to the audience here?
Sure. So my name is Ellie Bladen. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. And so broadly, I work on evolutionary biology, so the evolution of parental care, using the burying beetle. The species I use is called Necrophorus vespiloides.
So, great. So, what have you been actually, since when have you been doing so? And like, of course, beetles and insects are not quite something which people are interested in. So how do you get your interest in burying beetles or such insects?
So I actually did my master's degree as well on burying beetles, and it came about because I was originally interested just sort of more broadly in behavioural ecology, so why animals do the things they do, and evolution. So, you know, how have we ended up having such a diversity of animals on the planet? And the reason I ended up working on burying beetles specifically is because in the lab that I work in, my supervisor, who is Professor Rebecca Kilner, everyone in her lab works on burying beetles. So they're a really good study system where you can look at lots of different questions, basically. So I work on stuff kind of in the lab specifically. I sort of ask questions, mainly things that we can do experiments on, whereas some people in the lab also work on burying beetles, but they do sort of field work, ecological studies to look at their behaviour outdoors. So that's why burying beetles specifically, but beetles in general has just sort of been an interest for a long time, just because they're very cool.
Exactly, they are indeed very cool, and especially the ones which eat meat, for example, the carcass beetles and burying beetles. But to be honest, I have read Charles Darwin book. I have it right here as well, Origin of Species, and it's very hard to understand what exactly is going on. So from where did life began and all these things. So can you just take us on a journey on the summary of how is evolution? Like, how can you understand evolution from all these observations through the beetles?
Yeah. So the things that I do are sort of, I look at the evolution of parental care. So it's quite a specific part of evolution in general, but we can kind of. Charles Darwin set up a very sort of simple way of understanding evolution, which is basically that, we see natural variations happen in nature, mutations pop up, basically, changes in an individual will pop up. If that change is beneficial, then they're more likely to be able to breed. They're going to be more attractive to the opposite sex. So those genes which led to those kind of beneficial mutations are going to be passed on to their offspring. If those mutations are not beneficial, they're less likely to be passed on. And that's kind of how we get evolution happening over a sort of large time scale. In the lab, the way that we look at evolution is by essentially making changes and seeing what happens as a result of that. So when I should sort of go a little bit of a background. So the beetles that I work on, like you said, they eat meat. So they breed on any dead things they find. So it tends to be dead vertebrates. So things like birds, mice. They don't kill them themselves. They just things die naturally in nature, and they've got this incredible antennae on their head which can smell these dead things from kilometers away, and they fly to the carcass. They will fight each other so that essentially one male and one female are in control of that carcass. They breed on it, and then what usually happens is that they both the male and female will stick around for a bit. They guard their larvae, their offspring. They will feed them. But sometimes we get a little bit of variation in that, because maybe the male or the female might die, they might get spooked and desert. And in that case, the larvae sometimes survive. And it's that kind of variation that makes burying beetles so interesting to study evolution, because we can sort of make changes in the lab, such as the amount of parental care that we're letting them have, and see what results from that over a number of generations. And that's why the burying beetle is so good for looking at evolutionary change.
So, and you said as burying beetles, their name suggests that they carry carcasses underground to feed on them, right?
Yeah, so they're amazing. I mean, I can show you a quick video if I can share my screen if you'd like to have a look. Because basically they, so yes, they're quite small. They're brilliant. Okay, I've got host control, so I'll show you a quick video.
I have actually got some carcass beetles here, and I think they're used in museums to preserve the skeletons and the skulls, right? For example, here, but it's truly astonishing. Like sometimes the larvae eat the parents, sometimes, and I had only two. I didn't know whether they were male or female, and I ended up having I think 20 or 30 of larvae, and they eat quick. So burn beetles are just
they're incredible. So I'll show you a quick video of this is not my video, it's one that was taken in the lab that I'm in. So you should be able to see my screen. So this is a video taken over 48 hours, and it shows two burying beetles preparing a mouse. So the mouse starts off, normal mouse looking, and let's just start this, and it turns to sorry, let me.
So at the end of the day, you won't find the mouse, but you'll find its skeleton.
Yeah, well, not even a skeleton actually. So it's right. Let me show you this. It actually, so it starts off as a mouse like this. This is a time lapse over 48 hours. As you can see, the burying beetles themselves are very small. They're probably about the length of the end of your thumb, I'd say. And the mouse is quite a lot bigger than them. And in this video, essentially, you're just seeing these beetles. They start ripping off the fur. They spread antimicrobial exudates all over it. And what I mean by that is it's basically fluids that they produce from their mouth and their anus. And the point of those fluids is that they stop other microbes, bacteria from growing on it that might be competition to them. But as you can see from this video, it went from being a mouse to being this like little squishy ball in only 48 hours. Now at this point, they will bury it underground, and they'll start feeding their larvae off it. And this next video, again, it was taken by someone else in my lab. It shows you the feeding process. So these larvae are a few days old now. And you'll see in a second that the parent comes up essentially to feed them. So there you go, we've got a parent coming along. And what she's doing is chewing bits of carcass meat off from that sort of squishy carcass ball and feeding it to her larvae. So like you were saying, what you end up with actually, in most cases, is not even a skeleton. It's and that's with this species, so it differs a little bit with species, but with this species, what you end up with is actually hardly anything left over at all. It's maybe like a little, if we're talking about a mouse, it might be like a little bit of sort of tail, or maybe a little bit of skull. But they are so efficient. They really do turn dead things into hardly anything at all. And by hardly anything at all, I mean, they're decomposers. They turn it back into the soil, essentially.
Because by observing the carcass beetles I've got here, I saw that they don't have, much of a big, mandibles to chew over the meat. And I was actually astounded. I was like, how is it possible? Because even like rhinoceros beetles, they have all these small mouth parts which they use. And I was actually amazed by seeing the video you shared, because I've always seen the parent is very solitary. Like the larvae feed on themselves on the meat of the carcass beetle, and the oral feeds on it as well. And it's just astonishing what 48 hours has done. And I think that's the main reason of why carcass beetles are used in the, let's say, museums to preserve the skull or animals, skeletons in such great ways. So Ellie, what do you think? How do of course, how do these burying beetles help the natural world? Like how are they related to us, let's say?
So in terms of the way that why we should appreciate them, you gave a very good point there, right? So I guess the important thing to take away is when they're cleaning something very small like this, it will completely go away. And like you said, in a museum, they can use them to clean big things, and that's when you're left with a skeleton, exactly as you say. But if we talk about things on a smaller scale, like these little mice that get left out, if we didn't have things like burying beetles, then we'd be left with a lot of dead stuff around, and that would just be unpleasant in itself. But also, they provide an important function because they're turning nutrients back into the soil for, other animals and organisms to use. So we should appreciate them really for that kind of effect. It might be disgusting to a lot of people, but it's just sort of part of the natural working of things.
Exactly, it's a part of the natural world. But Ellie, of course, what would happen, let's say, of course, you have got the main dominant male and female that are going to take over the carcass. So, let's say in the natural world, what happens if that, by of course natural cause, let's say a bird or an owl or whatever, he feeds on these burying beetles, feeds on the male and female. So how are the larvae supposed to survive?
Yeah, so in the cases where where the parents do die or desert, the larvae tend to just try and chew up the carcass themselves. So in a case where I just showed you there, the parents feeding the larvae will, as they get a little bit older, start to feed themselves as well. So if they just don't have any parents around, because the parents get eaten, the larvae will just try to feed themselves. Now sometimes this will work and sometimes it won't. When it does work, generally the larvae end up a bit smaller, and then they become smaller adults, and the problem with that is that they are then less competitive when they themselves want to fight for a carcass to breed on. Now what we have done in the lab, and this is sort of a lot of what I do my PhD on, is looking at so if we have two lines of beetles, and by lines we mean sort of evolutionary lines, so over evolutionary time we'll give them specific treatments. Now, if we have one line which we allow to show full parental care, and another line where we take the parents away every generation before they're able to provide that food to their offspring, we find that at first the larvae do really badly when they're not allowed to receive any care from their parents. But over a few generations, they start to have much higher survival. And that's essentially, we're going back to that sort of Darwinian evolution. It's because the larvae that had, traits that allowed them to survive with no parental care were more likely to survive, and therefore were more likely to breed and pass on those beneficial genes to the next generation. So we see that evolution in real time over, we're talking about 5 generations or something. So in the natural world, basically what you get when there's no parents around, as long as the parent has actually prepared that carcass nest, you'll see a lot of variation. Some larvae will survive, some won't. Maybe a whole brood will fail. So it's better to have parents if you're a burying beetle.
So it's natural selection itself, right? It's natural selection on its most extraordinary. But Ellie, like what? Of course, you have been doing this for a very long time, I suppose, and of course, have you seen burying beetles in the wild? Like whether you're going for a camp or trip, have you seen any of them in the wild?
I have, but only once actually. So I spend most of my days with them, and then I've only ever seen them once in the wild. And that's because they tend to, so the species that I work with, they tend to only come out at dusk, really. So just as it's going dark. And they're not very big. So they've got orange patches on their back, which makes them a bit more visible, but they're quite small. So if you really look, and you'll know this because you look for beetles a lot, but you really have to look for them. So unless you're looking out, you probably won't see them. And they spend a lot of time underground or in the undergrowth as well. So it is very exciting when I see them in nature. But yeah, only once.
Yeah, because actually beetles are nocturnal and it's a bit hard to find them at night. But Ellie, what do you think? Like in the past few years that you have been doing this, have you thought, like in the wild, has their populations like decreased, or has it been in the same level or something like that?
So with this particular species, it's a bit hard to tell exactly what the population has done. But what I will say is that their habitat is decreasing, so it's becoming fragmented. In Cambridgeshire, where I am, we used to have huge areas of ancient woodland, and this species is very much a woodland species. Now that woodland is getting split up. People build villages and towns, and those large swathes of wood have now become small patches. So whilst we don't know exactly what's happened to the population sizes, it's very reasonable to expect that they have decreased quite significantly. The species I work on is not considered endangered, but there is a species in America called the American burying beetle, and that is definitely critically endangered. There's a lot of work going on with that beetle just from a conservation perspective to try and work out why it has decreased, and in some cases they're reintroducing them to the wild as well. But as you'll know, it's kind of, there's not a lot of point reintroducing something into the wild until you fix the problem, because it's just going to, the population numbers are just going to go down again. And again, in the case of the American burying beetle, the thoughts are that it has decreased because of fragmentation of habitat, so people get, again, just building towns, and potentially also because of sort of fertilizers and pesticides from agriculture. So even with the species that I work on, not technically endangered, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to do well in the long term.
So, for example, like I'm finding it a bit difficult to keep insects in home alive, because like sometimes there is outbreak sometimes, and so how do you keep them in the lab? Like, is of course a 48-hour long, I think it's in dark area, of course, but then like how is it possible that you can maintain the soil temperature, the soil, all the pH and everything that is required?
Yeah, no, you're right. It is tricky unless you have quite controlled environments. These species are quite hardy because they're temperate species, by which I mean, we find them in locations where we have winter and we have summer, and there's quite a big difference in those temperatures. So that means that they are naturally a little bit hardier. But in the lab, we have rooms which are controlled to 21 degrees centigrade. So that kind of means that year round they should breed as if they think it's summer, basically, because these burying beetles won't breed in winter, in British winter, because it's very cold. So we keep them at a temperature 21 degrees centigrade, and it's basically summer to them. We have them on a cycle in the lab that mimics British summertime, so that's 12 hours light, 12 hours dark. When we're not breeding them but they're adults, we feed them weekly on a bit of beef mince, because they are, they're meat eaters, essentially. They need some meat, so you wouldn't be able to feed them just on, vegetarian food. But so we feed them on a bit of mince, and then they breed on these mice. When they're breeding, then we again keep them at that same temperature, but we have to put them into darkened chambers to mimic the fact that they would be underground in nature. As you can see from the video, although it's a little bit less obvious because we've sort of pulled the soil away, we do give them boxes with soil so that they can bury that carcass underground, but it's not as deep as it usually would be in nature. So we do have to provide that darkened environment for them as well. So yeah, it takes a little bit of control. So I can see why it's a bit difficult. I've never tried to do it from home.
Yeah, giving them is always a bit difficult, especially if your parents don't like insects, and of course I've got a whole loads of specimens below, and the carcass beetles will eat on dead meat or whatever specimens they find, so it's a bit unsafe. But only, of course, I've seen the same on carcass beetles as well. Their abdomen is a bit black and white. And as you know, the ultraviolet colors in nature, let's say red and blue or orange and all these outstanding colors, are a sign of, for example, let's say they tell to an animal, I'm bad to taste, or indeed, let's say, it is poisonous. So what is the connection between the burying beetles having such beautiful colors on their carapace? Yeah,
so the species that I work on is orange and black. And it's just like you say, that the most what people think at the moment is that the reason why burying beetles are orange and black is to advertise that they wouldn't be nice to eat, basically. So it's a defense mechanism. Generally, animals, like very sort of broadly, animals tend to have bright colors for a couple of reasons. So it might be as a defense mechanism to say, I'm nasty to eat, don't try eat me, or it could be because they're trying to show off to the opposite sex. So it could be a case of, the brighter the beetle, the more attractive the female finds them. The reason why that's probably not the case in burying beetles is because both the males and the females are bright. So we think it's more likely to be a case of trying to advertise they're not nice to eat. What you do get in nature, as you'll know, is that sometimes animals that aren't poisonous to eat mimic animals that are poisonous to eat to basically try and pretend that they're dangerous like the other thing. Now, burying beetles, I think, probably would be.
Noelle, have you got disconnected?
Sorry, I lost my internet there. Have you got me back? Yeah.
Yes, you're back. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry. So, yes, I think burying beetles probably would be very unpleasant to eat, because when I said about these fluids that they produce from their mouth to make the carcass less microbial, they smell really bad. They're really awful. They probably taste bad too. So I think that it's probably genuine advertising that they are bad to eat. And I think that's probably what's going on there.
So, yeah, of course, I always tell people when I'm, for example, there are many students here as well, and many people over here listening. So, of course, whenever I visit the natural world, especially if it's a wild one, I always go and catch the beetles or whatever I find. And of course, whenever I go there, of course, I know the species. But what about like the people over here? If we are in the UK and we are going, of course, someone who's interested in beetles goes and tries to catch these, finds them and tries to catch these beetles. So, are they hazardous? Let's say, do they bite or do they do something that is nasty?
Yeah, so I'd say that so we do some, collect them from the wild sometimes. We would wear gloves, I'd put it that way. So because the fluids that I was just talking about, you don't want to put them in your mouth. I'm not sure what it would do, but it wouldn't be very hygienic. So, obviously always wash your hands, wear gloves. And the other thing is that because they breed on dead things, then obviously you've got some kind of bacteria there that you just don't want in your mouth or on you. In terms of their jaws, their mandibles, it depends a bit on the species as to how much that would hurt if they bite you. So Necrophorus vespuloides that I work on, in the lab I always wear gloves. They do sometimes try to bite at your gloves, and it doesn't go through the glove. So I'm talking about just a plasticky glove, right? It doesn't go through it. So if they bit your hand, you'd feel it, but I don't think it would draw blood. But then we have much larger beetles, sort of carrion beetles. So, for example, Necrophorus humitor, which is a big black burying beetle. Now, they have much bigger jaws. I've never been bitten by one, but I can imagine that would hurt a little bit. That probably could go through your skin, I think.
So, of course, I've also seen the same on the larva of the carcass beetles as well. Do you think the pointy spines or these hairs on the larva of the beetles, do they serve a purpose? Is it like, for let's say, feeding purpose, or it stings? So what is the purpose of all these hairs or sort of spines they have got on their back?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think it's probably going to depend on the species, right? So the species that I work on, they actually don't have much of that, but I know what you mean, because some species do. But it's not something which I'm particularly familiar with, because we don't have them in ours. So the species that you look at, do they have quite big spines?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
maybe it's a defense mechanism. It could be, again, because larvae are quite vulnerable. So maybe it's a defense mechanism against getting eaten, potentially.
Now, are there any predators that feed on these beetles underground? Like, let's say, like rodents underground or such. Are there any? Of course, they'll be very vulnerable when they come outside. There'll be owls and rats and many animals that will feed on them. And what about underground? Are they facing any danger underground, or only except humans? There is nothing else?
Yeah, so it's not something that's been studied in huge detail. I'd say underground, what the most danger is probably of competition. So other beetles, say, or other animals in general, trying to eat that carcass or take it over for themselves. But of course, there's no reason to think that necessarily there wouldn't be something else that would try and eat the larvae, some other kind of insect that berries, for example. And that's why the parents stay. So in this species, the mother tends to stay for about 8 days, 7 days, and the male tends to stay for maybe 4 days. And they're there as a defense mechanism. So obviously there is predation pressure, or at least competition pressure. Otherwise, there'd be no reason for the parents to guard them as well as, feed them.
Now, is there, of course, some animals, let's say like ants, they hibernate underground. You said I've never been to Britain, but I know that the winter is very cold as well. So how do they survive? Is it surviving on the beetles, like let's say mantids make the mucus fill egg cases so they can survive in the spring and summer, or is it like ants that they hibernate underground, or is it just they die and just magically come back in the summer?
This is a really interesting question, because actually for this species of burying beetle, it's sort of still under investigation exactly how they spend winter, because as you know, some insects will spend winter as eggs, some as larvae, some as adults, and that is still a question for these burying beetles, exactly what happens. So it's something that we're interested in at the moment.
So it's pretty difficult to tell then how they hibernate, right?
It's a bit tricky, and I think that the reason why it's tricky is because they'll be doing it underground. So what we tend to look at these beetles for are sort of evolutionary purposes, and we don't tend to look at them in the winter, because essentially we're looking at them when they're out and they're performing their sort of behaviours, and that tends to be from about there are the occasional burying beetle will emerge in the UK around now. That's very early. That's very occasional. I think I saw a report the other day that the first carrion beetle had been spotted this year. Generally, we tend to look at them from May, because that's when we're actually going to be able to find them to work on them. But yeah, essentially that's why we don't know, because they're quite secretive in winter. Whether they are, if they're adults, then it'll be because they're burying underground. The soil temperature is a lot more stable underground, so we think that whatever they're doing it underground to just try and keep a sort of temperature stability.
So the next question I think which I've got is a personal question. I'm finding it dramatically difficult to tell of course I think all beetles the genders you can observe in the same way, and I'm finding it difficult to tell how the beetles, okay, this one which I'm looking at is a female and that one is a male. I'm finding it difficult. Actually, when I found the carcass beetles, it was on the body of the Arabian gazelle, and I had picked up seven adults back then, and it was pretty difficult to say which one was male and female. I just randomly chose them, and then they ended up laying their eggs. So how do you tell that whether a burying beetle is a male or a female?
Right, so actually, first of all, it's really cool that you found them on a gazelle. We don't find anything as exciting as that in the UK. But yeah, so the species that I look at, you're looking at the end of the abdomen to tell whether they're male or female. So the male's abdomen is a little bit pointier, and the female's is rounder, essentially. And it's one of those things that you just sort of get your eye in. So when I first started working on them, I was kind of having to check with someone more experienced of okay, I think this is a female, is it a female? And now it's just become second nature, just because I've done it so many times. But luckily, in the species I work on, it is actually quite, as long as you practice, it's quite easy to get it in. So essentially, male pointy, female round is the broad way of telling.
So yeah, and what do you think, how has climate change affected the burying beetles?
So it's a bit hard to tell. The thing I would say is that, they're temperate species, right? In the ones that I work on are temperate species. So they're used to they're evolved to, perform their life cycle under certain temperatures. If, we found before where if we go out and collect them in particularly hot summers, then generally their survival is a bit lower. So as the climate changes, as we start to get more extreme summers, more extreme winters, it's very likely that that's going to start affecting their survivability and also their just ability to reproduce. It's not something which in burying beetles we're seeing specifically yet, but it's something we're seeing in so many species that it's very likely it's going to start happening. So, seeing reduced ability to produce offspring, seeing reduced survival, it is something very concerning because we are seeing temperatures rise.
Yeah, I've also seen, of course, cockroaches are even when you kill a cockroach, you better be careful, because when you're killing it, it may still produce its egg cases, out of when it's dead. But then, what of course, I've seen the same milk produced as you're saying in tsetse flies as well. And so, I'm living in the UAE, and of course, most of us here are also living in the UAE. So, Ali, what do you think? Is there a connection with us all the way to the burying beetles found in the UK? Are they connected to us in some sort of way?
I think, like, in a way, we're sort of all connected by, you know, the animals on the planet. And I think that the amazing thing is with, say, burying beetles, although you might not find the species that I work on there, you'll find something that performs a very similar function. And that's one thing that's so interesting about ecology, is the fact that we can see animals performing the same function in so many different places, despite the fact that they may not be directly related to each other. And we call that convergent evolution. So essentially the idea that, you know, animals will evolve to do the same things, even if they're not really that related, just because it's a way of getting on, surviving, reproducing. There's a niche available to fill.
Not only, of course, what do you think, like how many years, I think it's a very long time, has the ancestors of what the burying beetles themselves been on the planet?
Oh, that's a really good question. You know what? I'm not sure, because essentially these will be related to a common ancestor with beetles, you know, I dare say millions of years ago. I'm not sure the exact time. But, you know, we see so much diversity in that time. Beetles make up such a huge amount of the diversity on the planet in terms of a percentage. And they'll have a common ancestor, but we just see such a range of diversity, and that's what's so incredible about beetles. You know, you can be studying one beetle and know nothing about another one just because they're so different.
Now, Ali, what do you think? Even the last class I had with all the students in here, one person came up with a point and said, when I go and explore the natural world, I find characteristics of animals differently everywhere. And I also have mentioned the same, like, whenever I go and find an animal, it's always, this beetle is different than the one of the same species. Their personality and characteristics different. What about the burying beetles? Like, what sort of characteristics they have? Are they moody, or are they like sort of a let's go eat?
That's interesting. So there's, a branch of science which looks at personality, essentially, and it's not something I work on, but the kind of premise of it is that personality is where you can get an individual to act in the same way multiple times. So if one individual one thing they tend to look at is things like, how bold an animal is. And they base that on often something they call explorability. So you'll put an animal into, say a beetle. You put a beetle into a maze, and you can put something kind of interesting in there, something kind of new, maybe something that makes a little sound or something. And you see how likely that particular individual beetle is to try and explore and see what's around, or whether they're more likely to just hide in a corner and just not want to go near it. And if you find that, individuals will repeat the same kind of behaviour multiple times, but there are differences between what beetles are likely to do, then you'd say that they have sort of different boldness personalities. I don't know whether this is something that's been done in the beetles I study, but it is an area of research that people look into, whether we can see these personalities. Because, the opposite of it is just the idea that, animals are incredibly variable. What they do from time to time is just based on the particular circumstances and kind of random variation. So that's the opposite of the idea that they have personalities. And essentially, I'd say it differs in species whether we see those personalities or not. It's not something I can say that I've personally seen in beetles, but obviously we know that we see it in, say, dolphins, for example.
Now, of course, from the carcass beetle point of view, I've seen that when they are looking for a carcass, the male or female, they fly to the carcass, and it's not something which they need to dominate. There are 200, 300 beetles on one carcass, depending on the size. So, are the burying beetles as well like a land beetle or an aerial one which has a good eyesight and looks for its prey, or one which goes by, let's say, sense of smell or sense of surrounding environments?
Yeah, it's more of a sense. So they have these antennae that are incredibly sensitive. So they're essentially picking up chemical cues for the environment. In the species that I look at, we know that they can sense things decaying, so dead things, from kilometers away. And that's essentially because they're sort of picking up that scent of death in their antennae. which is incredible. But yeah, you're right. It's not an eyesight thing. It's really a sensor situation, which is actually kind of better than eyesight in this case, because there's lots of things in the way. You wouldn't necessarily be able to see that far. I certainly wouldn't, but the chemicals can reach that kind of distance. It's amazing.
Now, of course, the chemicals, as you mentioned, that they of course spread around their prey or in their carcass. Is it sort of like let's say an amylase or a protease? Is it like an enzyme, or is it something which is let's say something to keep the bacteria away, or is it just for the smell, or just what is it actually for, the chemical which you're putting on it?
Yeah, so I'm not exactly so as in the stuff that they produce with their the fluids that they produce.
Yeah, the fluid which they produce, are they like enzymes, or you said of course they expire to like.
Yeah, so there's definitely an enzyme component to it, because so part of what they're doing with it, like I said, is the sort of kind of trying to keep away other bacteria and microscopic creatures that might compete with them. But also what that fluid is doing is breaking down that carcass into something kind of more edible, something a bit squishier and softer for their larvae. So there is an enzyme component which will start breaking down that flesh.
Now, of course, in Britain and of course in many countries, there are invasive species, and of course we know that's except climate change and all these problems, there are problems in the natural world that are being led by invasive species. So, is there any species in Britain, any invasive species in Britain that are affecting the survival of the burying beetles?
So not that we know directly with the burying beetle, because the species that I look at, they live in forests. Obviously we do have invasive plants. There's no reason to think at the moment that's directly affecting the burying beetles, but you're right that it is affecting a lot of other species. So in the UK we have problems with aquatic invasive species, so the quagga mussel, the zebra mussel, invasive plants like Himalayan balsam, giant hogweed. So we know that it's affecting the environment more generally, and there's so much to talk about there. I did a period of time working on quagga mussels, for example, and the effects they have on the ecosystem. But I can't say that we know specifically any effect of invasive species on burying beetles at the moment. But as you know, with a lot of these things, right, it's about getting the information, and if we don't have the full information yet about their ecological environment, we can't know for sure. And that's partly why research is so important. And some of my colleagues do very ecological research, looking at the burying beetles in their natural habitat. So it's definitely something that's still open as a question.
Now I've seen, of course, the natural world in many unrestricted places. In my backyard, in front of even somewhere with flies in my house, let's say it's beetles or so. Of course, what do you think? For example, let's say, what if the burying beetles don't exist? Of course, we know there are many fungi that feed on dead animals. There are many, let's say, rats are omnivores, so they feed on whatever comes in their path. There are many cockroaches that are carnivores. So what do you think specifically that, okay, if, of course, I hope it never happened, but what if the burying beetles goes extinct? That particular species that you are working on, what would happen to the ecosystem or the natural environment that they are in?
So you're right that other animals do provide those decomposition services, but essentially burying beetles are really efficient decomposers. So if we didn't have burying beetles, we would see a lot more dead stuff around, and we'd also see a knock-on effect on other species, because like you say, fungi, for example, are decomposers, but often they need it to be a bit more broken down before they can feed on it. So one great thing about burying beetles is that they break that material down, it goes back into the soil, and it becomes available for other organisms like fungi to then use in its more broken down state. So I'd say for humans, we'd see more dead things. For other animals, we'd see less availability of nutrients.
Now I'm finding it a bit difficult to provide food for my beetles, because finding meat, especially all around here, it's a bit difficult. So how do you get all these, like let's say the rats or all these things? Is there like a breeding area where it's only based on rats, or you just get one or ask for one from other, let's say organizations or universities?
Yeah, so in the lab we use mice which are basically snake food. So a lot of people keep snakes as pets, and there are companies that provide dead mice, already dead mice, for snake feed. So we just use a small proportion of those. Basically, it's a very tiny proportion of the mice that are kind of produced, because there's a lot of people with pet snakes. But yes, luckily I don't have to kill anything. It all comes to me already like that, because that's something that I personally would find very difficult. And we do occasionally find things just dead out in nature, and if we just want to kind of look at something in its natural habitat, then we will kind of monitor something like that, something that we find naturally dead. But when we're doing very controlled experiments, obviously we want to keep things as as clear as possible. Everything needs to be as similar as possible, and that's when these kind of snake food mice come in.
Now, of course, it'll take us some time for the bedding beetles to find the carcass in the wild. So I of course found the same thing, difficulty in the carcass beetles as well. Like when I find an animal that is dead and I find maggots inside, as we know, maggots are nasty creatures. They produce all this slime and all these mucus and all, and the carcass beetles don't like them at all. And I was observing this thing that the carcass beetles actually cut that area that the maggots are in, and they just toss it away in somewhere else. So what about the bedding beetles? Until, of course, I think they find a fly would have come and laid eggs on it, and the maggots would have hatched. So what do they do with that? Do they leave it alone, or do they try to fight for the carcass itself?
So that is a source of competition, you're right. So sometimes when we go to the field to try and catch burying beetles, so I should probably give a bit more information about this. So we'll put out traps which contain a dead mouse, for example, and it's a trap whereby the beetles can get in easily, but they can't get back out. And what that means is then we can look at it and we can count the number of beetles. Maybe we can take them back for lab populations or just release them. So they're not harmed in there, it's just that they can't get out. And yeah, essentially sometimes you come to those traps and you find that actually blowfly larvae are already in there, and a beetle hasn't made it, but the flies have. And that's partly just to do with random variation. Maybe the flies found it first. But there definitely is competition between flies and beetles on a carcass. I talk about the beetles competing with each other, but they do also compete with other organisms. So that's one reason why they produce these fluids, because they're sort of they're fine for burying beetles, but they're less palatable for other insects. And if you have a carcass where you've got flies and burying beetles, then generally, because I'm sort of talking about smaller carcasses, generally it will reduce the burying beetles' success on that carcass. So maybe their larvae will be a little bit smaller, maybe there'll be fewer larvae. But essentially burying beetles don't want that competition with flies. So, you're right, it's not an ideal situation, and it does reduce their ability to produce lots of big larvae if they have to deal with that competition.
Now, of course, what if, of course, mice is a small little creature, but what if, let's say, a cat or a deer falls in their sort of territory? So how do they deal with that sort of huge piece of meat, we can say?
Yeah, and I guess this is the sort of size of things that you're thinking about when you were saying about them cleaning things for museums, for example. So yeah, they can't completely, the beetles I'm talking about can't completely destroy something like that, so that you would end up with a skeleton left behind. But if they find something like that in nature, then either they'll just eat some of it, because adults have also got to eat, or if it's a sort of smaller object which is just a bit too big for one pair, you might find 2 breeding pairs on one animal, and they're not really cooperating. It's not that they're working together, it's just that there's enough space that they are able to kind of be on the same carcass without competing too much. But it's the larger the carcass, generally the less well that they do on it. So there is a limit to how much they can cope with preparing into a carcass. So we find sometimes in the lab that there's sort of an ideal size of carcass that they can roll up, feed their larvae on, And if you get too big, then they expend so much energy just trying to roll that up that actually they end up having lower success. So if you think about something like a deer, they're just not able to roll that up. It's just too big. And that's when you start to get things like, maybe if something falls off it, they could use that, but maybe they'll just eat some of it because they can't roll it up, basically.
So yeah, of course, how many, this is of course a question which is I think a bit difficult to answer because of course accounting is a bit difficult. So how many beetles do you think you have got in the lab, and how hard it is, and what all you do, to take care of it?
Yeah, so I probably have at the moment about 60 pairs of, so I've just had 60 pairs of beetles, so they probably, each of those has produced about 30 larvae. So, we're talking like hundreds. There are other people working in the lab. So I'd say at any one time we have like thousands of beetles on the go. Because we're doing like evolutionary stuff, we have to kind of know which beetle has come from where. Because if you're doing evolutionary lines, you want to make sure you're breeding the beetles with the same treatment that they came from. So each beetle as an adult is kept in an individual box. It's quite roomy, individual box with some soil, so they're fine. They get fed some meat once a week, and then they breed together. We breed them with the appropriate male or female, and we do that in bigger boxes with a mouse and some soil again. They take about, from putting the beetles in with a mouse, it's about 8 days until they've, laid eggs, the larvae have hatched, they've fed them, and the larvae are ready to disperse away. In nature, the larvae would just crawl away from the carcass and bury themselves into the ground, and they stay there very, very still for about 20 days. And during that time, they go from looking, kind of maggoty to looking more like an adult beetle, and that's their pupation stage, and they're changing a lot during that stage. To mimic that in the lab, because we can't just let them wander off and stay still somewhere, we put them into these boxes which have got lots of little cells, and we fill that with soil, and that's somewhere where they can just stay still for 20 days, at which time we then take them out and we put them into those individual boxes I spoke about first. So it's a cycle of about 6 weeks, and it's, when you have a lot of beetles, it's quite time consuming, but it works. So
now only of course, what if there's a lot of number of beetles that you cannot keep? So do you leave it in the wild, or of course preserve it for further study on evolution? Let's say museums do, they have all the entomology in the box. So what do you deal with the excess of beetles that you have in the lab?
Yeah, so if it's so beetles in the lab, if there's excess, a lot of them will get preserved for example, molecular work. So if we want to look at DNA work or RNA, a lot of them get preserved for that kind of thing. So at the moment, I'm doing some work kind of looking at basically the sort of microbial composition in beetle guts, and in that case, we will euthanize them and keep them sterile for that kind of work. So yeah, I mean, like you said, you do end up with quite a lot, because 2 beetles will produce 30 larvae or something. But luckily, we usually have something kind of experimental to do with them. Occasionally, yes, they might go to museums. A lot of the time, museums already have quite a lot of beetles. In the museum in Cambridge, we're very lucky to have Darwin's beetles, the ones that he collected, which is quite exciting because you can go and see them, and you remember that Darwin had his hands on them, which is a very strange thought.
Now, of course, there are many beetles in the lab, as you mentioned earlier. But then, what do you think that, let's say, all the individuals that are here, or myself, can do to save, the bearing beetles from danger, or saving the natural world itself? Because of course, when you are working with the natural world, even when I'm working in something which is related to the natural world, I see that every time I go to the natural world, their populations increase. They're facing massive, damage on their populations and on their habitats. So what do you think each of us can do to save bearing beetles, or maybe to save the natural world that we love?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think that there's this, individuals can only do so much. Obviously, there are the things that as an individual, if you want to make a difference, kind of think about where you, like partly the way that you kind of live your life, where you spend your money. So this is something which is quite easy for me to say as someone who's able to like make these changes quite easily. But for example, I don't really fly anymore. I've stopped flying because I don't personally need to. Now I know that that's quite coming from quite a privileged position because I don't have family that live really far away, and I get that some people do need to fly just for basic needs. But I'd say things like don't fly if you don't need to. Reduce your meat intake unless if you're already vegetarian or vegan, great. But if you're not, reduce your meat and dairy intake. And when you buy things from places, think about whether you support that company's environmental policies. And again, this is sort of coming from a position of privilege, because like a lot of people have to just go with the cheapest thing, because like in the UK, so taking a UK example, right, I can say that I am not going to buy from fast fashion places because they their environmental record is very bad. But then there's a lot of poverty in the UK, and some people aren't able to make that choice. So I'd say where you are able to make that choice, where you have the ability to do so, think about where you're spending your money and think about whether that company are respecting environmental policies. So I'd say that things like that. Obviously there's things you can do about reducing general buying, because a lot of the time we buy stuff we don't really need. So consider, do you need that new phone, whatever piece of clothing, and things like reusable plastic items, or moving away from plastic. I'd say that like as individuals, essentially we kind of have to put our money where our mouth is. So if you have the ability to buy more sustainable products, that's a good way to do it.
Of course, when I visit the natural world, where of course our area is full of deserts. We don't have much, the rainforest around and all such. But when I travel, I of course go there. But when I visit a desert, when I see the impact of plastic and all these, human activities thrown all over there, let's say it's invasive species, plastic pollution, climate change, it really makes me, like very sad that in the future, if we continue, we cannot see beetles, we cannot see the natural world, because I have seen myself living in desert countries. All these beetles and bees and insects, they actually do get, let's say, they get overheated. As we know, when we go outside and in a very hot day, we get overheated and we need, nice cool glass of water. But then, like, animals are dying due to climate change. So how do you feel about that? Like, what do you think is the main, impacts that we are doing? So that, is it like that? Because I believe it's that we don't have much. It's because we don't have much information about the natural world. We don't have much information about beetles. We don't have much information about what's happening around us. So what do you think is the main, let's say, the main problem that is having to deal with all these environmental activities?
I think like it's kind of, and you will have seen this through like David Attenborough documentaries, that there's partly a way of talking about these environmental issues that we kind of get people on board. We inform them about the problems without making them feel like they can't be fixed, because once people feel like the problem is just too big that it can't be fixed, then people become complacent, right? So over the years, watching David Attenborough documentaries, they've very much gone from, wow, look at this amazing nature, to look at this amazing nature and also look what's happening to it. And the climate change thing is not something that used to be mentioned, and David Attenborough has realized that over time actually we do need to talk about these things. So it's making people aware, making people love nature itself, showing them how incredible it is, but then also showing them that we can make a difference. Like, if you were doing a business proposal, you wouldn't say, okay, everything is terrible, my business is terrible, please give me money because it's so awful. You would say, okay, like, this is what it could be, therefore give me money so that I can make it what it could be. And that's kind of where we need to get that balance. We need to show that there's a lot of bad stuff going on, but we can make a difference. Like, there is optimism out there. And this is becoming quite a kind of movement towards conservation optimism. There's a lot of this going on through some, academics at Cambridge, to remind people that all is not lost, but we do need to make changes. And I think that's one of the things. It's the way that we talk about it. We need to sort of instill that hope, but it's only hopeful if we really try.
So, of course, before we move on to the conclusion, of course, many people are here. So, do you have any question about, of course, beetles and the exotic career of Ellie? So, if you have got any question, you can ask her before we continue.
Hello, I would like to ask a doubt. I just want to know, I've heard about insects spread diseases. Why do they spread, or how do they spread the diseases?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So it's something which people say a lot. In my experience, it's not something that I particularly experienced, but it depends what you're talking about. So if you think about species that might spread malaria, for example, so mosquitoes. So mosquitoes are an insect, and mosquitoes do spread malaria. So there are certain precautions that need to be taken in that case. And obviously that is a very devastating disease, kills many people. And we need to be mindful of that. I suppose if you think about something like a burying beetle, if you touch the carcass, then obviously that's dirty. Tsetse flies, spread sleeping sickness. There are specific examples. Insects in general don't spread diseases, but certain insects spread very devastating diseases. So, it's just important to have a bit more knowledge around which insects we should sort of be wary of and which ones actually are harmless and just interesting.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anyone else who is next to ask the questions? I guess everyone understood that what you were explaining is Zian is here. Please go on, Zian.
So out of all the amazing creatures on this planet, what inspired you to study and research about these beetles specifically?
So it was really the fact that with beetles they have short life cycles and they have this elaborate parental care. And if you put those two things together, you realize how quickly you can actually look at the evolution of parental care. If we think about elephants, for example, if you want to look at evolution in elephants, you're going to have to look over sort of thousands of years. If you want to look at evolution in beetles, you can look over a timescale of a couple of years, and that's incredible. So I think it's that interest in, for me, parental care combined with an insect that shows those incredible features whilst also having a quick life cycle where you can actually see it happening in real time.
What about Tariq? Tariq, do you as well have a question? Yes, please go on.
Yes, I have a doubt. How long do adult beetles stay alive for? How long do they live?
That's a really great question, and it depends whether they are in a lab environment or in a natural environment. Because in a natural environment, they're going to have a lot of predators. So, some predators, and also just, things happen, they might not survive as long. So in a natural environment, we know that they generally tend to breed once. So from becoming an adult to having their first set of offspring is generally they'll start to breed at about 7 to 14 days after emerging as adults, and then they'll breed once, and then some of them will die. So in that case, maybe they've only been alive for potentially even 14 days after being adults. But we know that some do go on to breed twice, so then you're probably talking about 4 weeks as an adult. And after that, it is rare for them to breed more than twice. Whereas that in a lab, if we keep them in an environment where they're well fed, they're not stressed, they're not predated, then actually we've seen some live to 100 days after being an adult, which is absolutely mad, and it probably wouldn't happen in nature, but we know it's kind of biologically possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else has got any questions? Dr. Vasri wants to ask a question, a comment, I think.
Hi, this is Rahim. Actually, I'm not a person who was specialized in the context that you're actually talking about, but I'm really interested the jobs that you're doing. I'm going to congratulate the group and Irfan and Ali of having this meeting. Perhaps, I would say that, our environment has changed a lot during the last 50 years. Through my ages that I've seen, on my own eyes, and this is really fascinating that some people are actually interested on the things that is happening in the world actually, and in our environment. So perhaps poor societies are more actually affected compared to rich societies because of they have no access to lots of things, and they try to sell out their environment and their resources to live. But we have to consider that we are living in one whole world, and all of us are living in one ship, perhaps, and no matter what happened anywhere. So this affect, definitely, change the whole world to the other places. Thanks God that you people are a generation that thinking about these things. My major actually is chemical engineering. I'm not actually the person who can comment on the things that you're talking about. So, as a family friend with Irfan, so I was, admired to be in this meeting. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, and I will say actually, Irfan, it's really good that you're bringing these things up, because it's really interesting, and it's not something which is necessarily spoken about everywhere. So it's a great job, and I think you're definitely right, Rahim, that it does affect potentially poorer nations more, and this is why I sort of mention privilege. It would be very easy for me to sit here and say everyone has to do this, everyone has to do that, but ultimately, if the UK can't reduce its emissions, then why should we expect other people? So we have to, like in sort of richer nations, we have to sort of make the changes that we can make, and not expect everyone to be able to make those changes. So yeah, we still have a long way to go, but it's great, Irfan, that you're bringing up these issues.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Rahim, as well. So, of course, we are reaching our end of our session, and it was an amazing initiative talk with Ellie. So, Ellie, what do you think of the works that I do? Of course, I'm not quite an expert as you are, but I've been researching on Amazon Plants for the past 6 years and trying to spread awareness as I can to save our planet. And of course, I'm doing things in my own life that can reduce the emission of carbon and all these things. And I believe that together we stand, and we can become the heroes of our own planet.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what? The thing about evolutionary biology is that I use one species to ask big questions. I dare say you have a better, overall knowledge of, biodiversity than me. And the great thing is that, you obviously are doing a lot of stuff locally, and I think that by doing stuff locally, you can inspire people locally, and then maybe that spreads out from there. I think it's really great to be passionate about nature around you, and just to know more about the diversity around you. It's something which is just dying out a bit. So yeah, great work.
So anyone else that has got a question for Ellie? Any questions about evolution, about the beetles? Of course, I asked many questions only about beetles, not much about evolution. Anyone has a question about the biology of beetles or the evolution? If not, then we can continue and finish the meeting.
Actually, I have a question. How do beetles and other insects communicate together?
That's a really great question. So it depends on the species, but there are different cues that they take from each other. So some make noise, and those noises might mean something. So, for example, beetles, if they're stressed, they make a little squeaking noise. And if you've got a pair of beetles on a carcass, if the male makes a squeaking noise because he sees a predator, then the female is going to notice that and realize that there's some danger going on. Also chemical cues. So we know that their cuticle, which is their version of skin, essentially, the hard stuff that's on them, we know that gives off hydrocarbons. Basically, it's releasing essentially a chemical, which means that they can sense it, and there's a lot of information in that. So, for example, they'd be able to tell whether another beetle is the same sex as them, the opposite sex, whether they are ready to mate. So it's a combination of kind of sound and chemicals that they communicate. But, we don't know exactly how much they can communicate and how detailed that is. And it's still an interesting area of research.
Okay, so I guess we have reached the end. It was a great session with you, Ellie. It was great learning about beetles. I learned a lot about, how to identify between the male and females, and it was just great. So I hope we can have more of these sessions in the future. And I hope you a great morning, I guess, over there, and here it's afternoon. So wish you a great afternoon and a great morning from your side, and a great day as well.
Brilliant. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.